The humid air of Daytona Beach in mid-September carries a specific weight, a mixture of salt spray from the Atlantic and the exhaust of 1,000 cars cruising the strip. But on the night of September 14, 2023, the atmosphere on Seabreeze Boulevard turned heavy with a different kind of tension. Just after midnight, the neon lights of the Coyote Ugly Saloon and the surrounding gift shops cast long, flickering shadows across the pavement. It was a typical Thursday night for the party crowd, but for a 5-month-old infant, it was the setting of a nightmare. The music was loud, the people were intoxicated, and at the center of the sidewalk stood 2 women treating a human life like a piece of sports equipment. This wasn't a tragedy born in secret. It was a public display of negligence that left onlookers paralyzed with a mixture of disbelief and fury. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. To understand the gravity of what happened, one must first understand the vulnerability of the victim. At 5 months old, a child is a marvel of fragile biology. Their neck muscles are only just beginning to support the weight of their head. Their bones are still soft, and their brain is highly susceptible to the shearing forces of sudden movement. Medical professionals call this stage exquisite vulnerability. Yet, on this concrete stage, Briana Lafoe and Sierra Newell seemed entirely disconnected from these biological realities. The witnesses who began to gather near the Crazy John's recreational cannabis shop didn't see a mother cradling her child. They saw a 19-year-old and a 20-year-old standing several feet apart, their faces flushed with what they later described as fun, as they began to toss the infant through the air. The mechanics of the act were as horrifying as the act itself. According to the formal affidavits and the harrowing accounts provided to the Daytona Beach Police Department, the women were not gently passing the child. They were launching him. The child's body would arch through the night air, illuminated by the red and blue neon of the bar district, before being caught, sometimes clumsily, by the other woman. With every catch, the infant's head would snap back and forth, a motion that can cause permanent neurological damage in seconds. But for Lafoe and Newell, this was a game. They were celebrating. Though what exactly they were celebrating remains a point of contention in the legal record. As the game progressed, the reckless energy shifted into something even more aggressive. Witnesses watched in stunned silence as Briana Lafoe, the biological mother, allegedly gripped the boy by his tiny ankles. In a move that defied every maternal instinct, she flipped the 5-month-old upside down. With the child's head dangling just inches above the hard, unforgiving concrete of Seabreeze Boulevard, she began to swing him. Not a gentle rocking motion, but a forceful vertical yo-yo motion. The sight was so jarring that it broke the bystander effect typically seen in crowded party districts. People stopped walking. The laughter from the nearby bars seemed to die down as the reality of the situation set in. This wasn't a parent playing with a child. This was a child being used as a prop in a display of total detachment. The bystanders began to move from observation to intervention. Several women in the crowd, some of whom were mothers themselves, began to shout. They pleaded with Lafoe to put the baby down, to stop the swinging, to think about the concrete. But the intervention was met with a chilling lack of concern. Instead of realizing the danger, Lafoe and Newell reportedly became defensive. The fun they were having was, in their minds, their right. When one witness pulled out a smartphone to document the abuse, knowing that without proof, no one would believe such a story, the situation turned violent. Lafoe, still clutching the infant in one arm, did not retreat. She did not tuck the baby away from the confrontation. Instead, she moved toward the woman filming. In a blur of motion captured on secondary cell phone videos, Lafoe reached out and struck the witness on the arm. It was a battery committed while the aggressor was literally holding the victim of her neglect. The child was caught in the middle of a physical altercation on a street filled with intoxicated strangers at 1 o'clock in the morning. The sheer randomness of the environment, the potential for a drunk driver, a physical scuffle, or a simple trip and fall, made the presence of a 5-month-old in that specific spot a crime of neglect before the tossing even began. The witnesses weren't just tourists. They were people who understood that they were watching a potential homicide in real time. They described the sound of the wind as the baby was tossed, the way the child didn't cry, a sign of shock that many found more disturbing than a scream, and the way the two women laughed as they ignored the pleas of the crowd. The Coyote Ugly scene, famous for its wild energy, had been eclipsed by a scene of much darker proportions. Someone finally dialed those three numbers that change everything: 911. While the dispatchers were receiving the call, describing two females tossing a baby like a toy, Lafoe and Newell remained on the scene. They didn't flee into the darkness of the side streets. They didn't try to hide the child. There was a profound sense of invincibility in their posture, a belief that as long as they were the parents, they could do whatever they wished with the life in their care. They stood on the corner of Seabreeze and Grandview, unaware that the sirens now screaming toward them weren't just coming for a disturbance. They were coming for a rescue. The police reports from that night would later detail the specific layout of the scene, the proximity to the bars, the condition of the pavement, and the exact distance between where Newell sat on the ground and where Lafoe stood. Every foot of that distance represented a moment where the baby was airborne, untethered to anything but the hope that an intoxicated 20-year-old would have the coordination to catch him. The surveillance footage from the nearby businesses began to be scrubbed and saved by managers who knew the police would be knocking. These digital eyes captured the tossing from multiple angles, creating a 360-degree record of the night. The concrete of Daytona Beach almost became a grave. As the first blue flashes of the patrol cars began to bounce off the glass windows of the shops, the crowd parted. The witnesses, holding their phones like shields, stepped forward to meet the officers. They were eager to share what they had seen, not out of a desire for drama, but out of a desperate need to ensure that the small, bobbing head of that 5-month-old wouldn't have to endure another toss. The lead officer stepped out of his vehicle, his hand resting instinctively on his belt as he surveyed the chaos. He saw the two women, he saw the stroller, and he saw the infant. But as he approached Briana Lafoe, he didn't see a woman who looked guilty. He saw a woman who looked ready to fight for her right to treat her child however she saw fit. What she didn't know was that the officer had already been briefed by dispatch, and the fun she was about to describe to him was already being classified as a felony. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. As the first Daytona Beach police cruiser screeched to a halt along the curb of Seabreeze Boulevard, the atmosphere was a volatile mix of neon-lit revelry and localized panic. The officers stepping into the fray were immediately engulfed by the sensory overload of a midnight disturbance. To their left, a crowd of witnesses was shouting, pointing, and waving their smartphones like glowing beacons of evidence. To their right, standing with a defiance that seemed entirely out of place given the gravity of the accusations, were Briana Lafoe and Sierra Newell. Between these two opposing forces sat a 5-month-old infant, still strapped into a stroller that had, just moments prior, been abandoned so he could be used as a projectile. The officers did not yet have the benefit of the video footage. They only had the raw, visceral testimony of the people on the street. One witness, her voice cracking with the adrenaline of what she had just seen, described the sight of the infant being swung by his ankles over the concrete. The officers, trained to look for signs of physical trauma, immediately turned their focus to the child. However, before they could even perform a cursory check on the infant's welfare, they were met with the defensive wall of the biological mother. Briana Lafoe did not approach the police with the relief of someone seeking help. Instead, she approached with the irritation of someone whose evening had been inconvenienced by busybodies. What follows on the body camera footage is a masterclass in the psychology of denial. As the lead officer began his questioning, Lafoe offered a narrative that was so drastically removed from the witnesses' accounts that it created a mirage of innocence. She didn't deny that the baby had been moved around. She simply rebranded the abuse as play. "We were just having fun with our baby," she told the officer, her voice steady, almost conversational. She claimed the infant was smiling and laughing while being tossed. To Lafoe, the concrete sidewalk of a bar district after midnight was a perfectly acceptable playground, and the physical act of tossing a 5-month-old back and forth was merely a bonding exercise. This mirage was supported by Sierra Newell, who sat nearby. The two women attempted to frame the entire incident as a misunderstanding fueled by Karen-like behavior from the crowd. They told the officers that they had been at the beach and were simply walking home. They claimed they had stopped because Newell's foot was hurting and she needed a break. According to their story, the tossing was actually just a gentle handoff because Newell was sitting on the ground. It was a calculated attempt to minimize the felony-level child abuse into a mundane moment of domestic logistics. However, the police officers on the scene were not novice investigators. They noticed the inconsistencies immediately. If the baby was being passed gently, why was the crowd in such a state of near riot? Why were strangers, people with no personal vendetta against these two women, screaming for the police? The officers began to separate the suspects, a standard tactical move designed to break down coordinated stories. While one officer kept Lafoe engaged, another moved to the witnesses. This is where the digital reality began to shatter the mother's mirage. A witness handed her phone to an officer, showing him a video that would later be described in the arrest affidavit as shocking. On the small screen, the officer didn't see a smiling baby being gently passed. He saw the 5-month-old being held by his lower extremities and swung with enough force to cause significant whiplash motion to the head and neck. He saw the child being flipped upside down over the hard ground, a height from which a single drop would almost certainly result in a catastrophic skull fracture or death. The officer's face, visible in the reflection of the phone screen, hardened. The fun Lafoe described was now being viewed through the lens of criminal evidence. As the officer watched the video, Lafoe continued her attempts to control the narrative. She began to complain about the people filming her, arguing that it was illegal for strangers to record her child. This is a common tactic used by those caught in the act of a crime, shifting the focus from their own actions to the perceived violation of their privacy. She was more concerned about the paparazzi on Seabreeze Boulevard than the fact that her son's brain had just been subjected to G-forces his tiny body wasn't built to handle. She even claimed that she was the one who called the police, or at least intended to, because the crowd wouldn't leave them alone. It was a bold attempt to flip the script and cast herself as the victim of a mob. The officers, now armed with the visual proof of the abuse, began to ask more pointed questions. They asked about the women's ages, both were under 21, and whether they had been drinking. The environment they were in, the Seabreeze Bar District, provided a silent answer. The smell of alcohol and the erratic, high-energy defensiveness of the women suggested that their judgment was severely impaired. The officer asked Lafoe if she realized how dangerous it was to swing a child of that age, especially over concrete. Her response was a shrug of the shoulders and a reiteration that the baby liked it. This lack of maternal alarm, the biological instinct to protect a child from even the hint of danger, was perhaps the most chilling part of the interaction. The tension escalated when the officers began to ask for identification. Lafoe's demeanor shifted from conversational to agitated. She began to worry about her maiden name, her current name, and most tellingly, her probation status. The mirage of innocence was starting to evaporate, revealing the jagged edges of a person who was already in the system and knew that this night could end her freedom. She started talking about trying to be a better person for her kid, an ironic statement given that her child was currently sitting in a stroller, potentially suffering from internal injuries she had caused. While Lafoe was distracting the lead officer with her life story, the sergeant on the scene was coordinating with the paramedics. The focus was shifting from the investigation of the mothers to the preservation of the child. The officers knew that shaken baby syndrome doesn't always show immediate external signs. A child can look fine or even quiet while experiencing a slow brain bleed. The fact that the baby wasn't screaming was not a sign of fun, as Lafoe claimed. It was a sign of potential trauma. The final crack in the mirage came when the officer confronted Lafoe with the battery charge. He told her that he had witnesses and video of her striking another woman while holding the baby. At this point, the reality of the handcuffs became inevitable. The fun was over. The smiling baby narrative had failed. The police had seen the truth on the tiny screens of the bystanders' phones, and that truth was about to lead to a felony booking. As the sergeant walked back toward the group, his gait was purposeful. He didn't look like a man coming to offer a warning. He looked at Briana Lafoe and then at Sierra Newell, and for the first time that night, he spoke with the finality of a judge. "You're going to jail," he said. But as the officers moved in to secure the women, a frantic Sierra Newell let slip a piece of information about the baby's recent medical history. A detail that made the officers realize the tossing they had just witnessed was even more dangerous than they initially thought. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. The moment the sergeant uttered the words, "You're going to jail," the carefully constructed facade of just a fun night out collapsed. But it didn't dissolve into remorse or tears for the child's safety. Instead, the atmosphere on Seabreeze Boulevard curdled into a toxic display of defiance. As the metal ratchets of the handcuffs began to click, the two women shifted from dismissive to combatively defensive. This phase of the night, captured in stark detail by multiple body cameras, reveals a chilling psychological disconnect. While the officers were focused on the potential of a brain-injured infant, Briana Lafoe and Sierra Newell were focused on their own inconvenience, their hatred for the snitches in the crowd, and a startlingly casual attitude toward the violence they had just inflicted. The arrest of Briana Lafoe was the first domino to fall. As she was escorted toward the patrol vehicle, her primary concern wasn't the 5-month-old being wheeled toward an ambulance, but rather the fact that people were still filming her. The privacy she demanded while standing on a public street after committing a crime became her obsession. "Quit filming my baby!" she screamed at the bystanders. A bitter irony considering she had been treating that same baby like an inanimate object only minutes prior. In her mind, the crime wasn't the tossing of the infant. The crime was the community's decision to document it. She directed a stream of vitriol at the witnesses, accusing them of being obsessed with her life, seemingly unable to grasp that their obsession was a desperate attempt to keep a child from hitting the pavement. As the officers began the formal process of reading Lafoe her Miranda rights, the conversation took a sharp turn into her past. Lafoe, perhaps sensing the severity of the situation, began to worry aloud about her probation. She knew that a child abuse charge, coupled with a battery charge for striking a witness, would likely trigger a violation that could keep her behind bars for a significant amount of time. Yet, even with her freedom on the line, she couldn't stop herself from arguing the merits of her parenting. When an officer explicitly mentioned the video evidence of her flipping the baby upside down by his ankles, Lafoe's response was a chilling attempt at gaslighting. "That's not shaking," she argued, as if there were a textbook definition of safe, inverted swinging for a 5-month-old whose fontanelle, the soft spot on a baby's head, hadn't even closed yet. Meanwhile, the investigation into Sierra Newell was reaching a boiling point. Initially, Newell had tried to play the role of the passive companion, but the witness statements and surveillance footage were undeniable. She wasn't just watching, she was a participant. She was the one sitting on the ground, arms outstretched, catching the infant as Lafoe launched him. When the sergeant approached her to place her under arrest for felony child abuse, Newell's reaction was explosive. The tired girl with a hurt foot persona vanished, replaced by a screaming, profane defiance. "What did I do? I didn't do shit," she yelled, her voice echoing off the storefronts of the now quieting bar district. The sergeant's response was clinical and firm. He cited the tossing, the swinging, and the reckless endangerment. But it was here that a new, darker detail emerged. In her frantic attempt to prove she was caring for the child, Newell blurted out that the baby had recently been ill, mentioning a stomach problem and a potential surgery. This revelation sent a wave of alarm through the responding officers and EMTs. If the child already had an underlying medical condition or a recent surgery, the tossing and swinging weren't just reckless, they were potentially lethal. The sheer forces of being swung by the ankles could have easily ruptured internal sutures or exacerbated a gastrointestinal issue. The mother's defense, that they knew the child best, was actually the strongest evidence of their negligence. If they knew he was fragile and recovering from illness, why was he being used as a toy in a midnight celebration? The scene grew even more surreal as the women were processed. Lafoe began to claim she felt sick, a physical reaction to the realization that her mirage of innocence had failed. The officer, ever professional, provided her with a barf bag, a mundane piece of plastic that stood in stark contrast to the gravity of the felony charges. As she sat in the back of the patrol car, her focus remained entirely self-centered. She argued with the officer about the legality of filming in public, showing a bizarre preoccupation with rights while ignoring the most fundamental right of her child, the right to safety. She even attempted to blame the bystanders for her own actions, suggesting that their harassment made her act out. The disconnect was most apparent when the topic of the child's destination came up. When the sergeant informed the women that the baby would be taken to Halifax Health for a trauma evaluation, they didn't ask about his health. Instead, they began to argue about which hospital was better, claiming that Halifax had made him sick previously. They tried to negotiate the medical care of a child they had just been swinging by his feet over a sidewalk. It was a power struggle they were destined to lose. The sergeant, a veteran of the force, looked at them with a mixture of pity and resolve. He wasn't taking medical advice from two women under arrest for child abuse. The final moments on the scene for Lafoe and Newell were defined by a total lack of maternal urgency. As the ambulance doors closed on the 5-month-old, the women were preoccupied with their jewelry, their bags, and their hatred for the people who had called the police. There were no cries for the baby, no pleas to see him one last time, no "I'm sorry." There was only the sound of the transport van's engine and the receding sirens of the ambulance. They were being moved away from the crime scene, but the evidence, the digital black box of the bystanders' phones, was already being uploaded to the police server. As the transport vehicles pulled away from Seabreeze Boulevard, the street began to return to its normal, neon-soaked rhythm. But for the officers remaining on scene to finish the paperwork, the night was far from over. They had to document the tossing distance, the height of the swings, and the exact spots where the women had stood. They were building a case that would ensure the fun Lafoe and Newell had that night would be scrutinized by a judge. The investigation was moving from the street to the station, but the most critical information was currently being gathered at the hospital, where a team of pediatric specialists was waiting to see exactly what fun looks like on the inside of a 5-month-old's body. Back at the station, as the booking photos were being snapped, a phone rang in the sergeant's office. It was a call from the trauma unit at Halifax Health. The initial x-rays were in, and the doctors had found a mark on the infant's arm that changed the entire narrative. It wasn't just a red mark from a toss. It was a sign of a potential injury that had been there much longer than one night, suggesting that the concrete playground might have been just the tip of a much deeper, more systemic iceberg of abuse. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. The fluorescent lights of the Halifax Health Trauma Unit provide a sterile, unforgiving contrast to the neon chaos of Seabreeze Boulevard. While Briana Lafoe and Sierra Newell were being processed into the Volusia County Jail, exchanging their street clothes for orange jumpsuits, the 5-month-old victim was the center of a different kind of intensity. Pediatric specialists and trauma nurses began the delicate process of assessing a body that cannot yet speak for itself. In cases of infant abuse, the story is told through skin, bone, and imaging. The child was no longer a prop in a celebration. He was a patient under the highest level of scrutiny. The initial medical examination was heartbreaking in its specificity. Doctors noted red marks across the infant's back and torso, physical signatures of the tossing and swinging described by the horrified witnesses. But the most concerning findings were not the ones visible to the naked eye. In infants, the skeletal system is still largely comprised of cartilage, and the brain is floating in a relatively large space within the skull. The tossing motion, where the child was launched through the air and caught, creates a deceleration force that can cause the brain to strike the inside of the skull, leading to internal bleeding or shaken baby syndrome symptoms, even without a direct impact. As the medical team moved the child to radiology, the tension in the room was palpable. They were looking for occult injuries, breaks or fractures that aren't immediately obvious but indicate a pattern of trauma. The X-rays revealed a suspicious mark on the infant's arm, initially feared to be a fracture. While further specialized imaging would eventually rule out a fresh break, the discovery sparked an immediate and intensive investigation by the Department of Children and Families, DCF. The mark became a focal point for investigators. Was this from the concrete playground, or was it a shadow of a deeper history of neglect? The medical consensus was that while the child escaped the night without shattered bones, He had been subjected to acute physical distress that posed a substantial risk to his life and neurological development. By 3 a.m., the shift in the case moved from the hospital to the cold reality of the Volusia County legal system. The arrest affidavits were finalized, detailing the counts of felony child abuse against both women, along with a battery charge for Lafoe. The documents painted a picture of a night where maternal duty was entirely surrendered to intoxication and ego. The reports didn't just list the crimes, they captured the psychological environment, the way the mothers prioritized their right to not be filmed over their child's right to survive. The legal process for Briana Lafoe moved with the grim efficiency of a system that has seen too many preventable tragedies. As the biological mother, the burden of care rested primarily on her shoulders. Her criminal history and her status as a probationer meant that the fun she claimed to be having carried a much higher price tag. In the months that followed her arrest, the bravado she displayed on the body camera footage began to wither under the weight of the evidence. The surveillance video from Crazy John's and the various cell phone recordings from the bystanders left no room for a misunderstanding defense. There is no legal or cultural definition of play that includes swinging an infant by his ankles over concrete. Facing the reality of a potential multi-year prison sentence, Briana Lafoe eventually entered a plea of no contest to downgraded charges. The legal maneuvering resulted in convictions for domestic violence battery and contributing to the dependency of a child neglect. While the felony child abuse charge was the initial focus, the neglect conviction reflected the totality of the night: the underage drinking, the late-night environment, and the total lack of protective instinct. The judge sentenced Lafoe to 364 days in the Volusia County Jail, followed by a lengthy period of supervised probation. For nearly a year, she would have to contemplate the 12:30 a.m. celebration from behind a set of bars, separated from the child she had used as a play toy. Sierra Newell's journey through the court system was more complex. As the wife and co-participant, her culpability was viewed through the lens of active participation in the endangerment. Her case was bound over for trial, but like Lafoe, the digital evidence was an insurmountable wall. She eventually faced her own reckoning with a plea deal for child neglect. The legal system, while providing a degree of closure, could not erase the digital footprint of that night. The names of Lafoe and Newell became synonymous with a specific type of modern-day horror, the viral crime where the perpetrators are more offended by the camera than the crime itself. But what of the victim? The 5-month-old was officially placed into the protection of the state. The motherhood Lafoe claimed as her shield was stripped away by the court to ensure the child's safety. He became a dependent of the state, a term that sounds cold but represented a warm, safe sanctuary away from the unpredictable swings of Seabreeze Boulevard. The DCF investigation focused on finding a stable environment where play involved soft toys and developmental support, not being launched into the night air of a bar district. The child's recovery was not just physical, but environmental, a transition from a life of props to a life of protection. The legacy of this case, however, extends beyond the jail sentences. It stands as a profound testament to the power of the active bystander. In many true crime stories, the tragedy occurs because people looked away or assumed someone else would help. On September 14, 2023, the crowd did the opposite. They broke the politeness of society to scream at a mother who was hurting her child. They stayed on the scene, they filmed despite being threatened and struck, and they handed their private data to the police without hesitation. Without those witnesses, the mirage of innocence Lafoe tried to project might have worked. Without the video, the police might have seen a tired mother instead of a reckless abuser. As we look back at the footage today, the most haunting sound isn't the shouting or the sirens. It's the silence of the baby. He didn't cry because his body was in shock, a physiological response to the trauma of being swung and tossed. It is a silence that should have sparked a mother's terror, but instead was used as a justification for fun. The Daytona Beach baby tossing case remains a chilling case study in the normalization of deviance, where a parent becomes so detached from the reality of their child's fragility that they treat a life like a basketball. The concrete playground is now just a regular sidewalk again. People walk over that same concrete every night on their way to the Coyote Ugly Saloon, likely unaware that a 5-month-old's life once hung in the balance right beneath their feet. But for the officers who saw the video, the witnesses who couldn't sleep that night, and the medical team at Halifax Health, the pavement on Seabreeze Boulevard will always hold a different meaning. It is the place where a child was almost lost to a game, and where a community decided that minding your own business was not an option when a life was on the line. Briana Lafoe and Sierra Newell had their night of fun, and the state of Florida gave them a year to think about it. The child, meanwhile, has been given the one thing his mother wouldn't give him: a chance to grow up without the threat of the pavement rising to meet him. And as always, you've been watching True Crime Story Vault, where every story is told with facts, clarity, and respect for the people affected. If you want to see more fact-based true crime stories like this one, make sure you subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. Until next time, remember, the truth is never buried.